Hi y'all, welcome back. I hope you had a nice spring break. I have two different lectures for you today. I'm smushing together chapter 8 and chapter 11. Chapter 8 is about aquatic biodiversity. Chapter 11 is sustaining and problems with aquatic biodiversity and the ecosystem services that they provide. I feel like the way we've been going in lectures and in class, this is better to smush together. So I've got a little bit and I'm crisscrossing them. I've used the headings from chapter 8 with then referencing to chapter 11. So if you're getting lost, let me know. I think that this makes sense and you'll follow along just fine. I want to talk about aquatic systems. I know for about half of you, this is much more your thing. So I spent a little bit more time trying to get some highlights of this stuff, and when we do our exercises for the next couple weeks, especially the lab going out, I want you to consider the aquatic systems that surround you, not just the big ones I'm talking about here, but I want to start big. Almost the entire Earth is covered in water. We tend to see a map of the Earth with the US in the middle of it, and it looks like we have water on either side, but you know it's a globe. If I look at the hemisphere of the opposite, so this is Australia, if I look at the southern hemisphere here, I really see that there's one giant ocean. And in fact, there is one giant ocean. When we talk about the ocean, we tend to divide it into 5 little areas. But those 5 little areas are just based on where we live and how we divide up the continents. So if you look, the Pacific Ocean runs into the Southern Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and then here we are back to the Pacific. The Arctic Ocean is just where it's really, really cold. I guess the Southern Ocean too. The ocean is global, and that means that the biodiversity in the ocean can be global too. Some things spend their lives traveling around the world ocean, and some are much more focused in some small region of the ocean. I listed them here, all of the oceans that we talk about. We're not going to look specifically at oceans here in this class, but where you go to the shore, you're going to the Atlantic. If you go to the opposite coast, you're on the west coast, you're in the Pacific. The Indian Ocean is off of the coast of Africa and India, obviously into Australia. The Arctic and the Southern Ocean are around the colder poles. So all of the living things in the oceans, but also in the freshwater systems, are aquatic biodiversity. And we do divide up all of those living things into biomes. In aquatic systems, we're more likely to call them aquatic life zones. I still use biomes all the time for them. I kind of talk about the biome at the top of a lake versus at the bottom of a lake. I feel like biome's a pretty useful word, but technically it's aquatic life zones. And what can live where is really governed in the water by things like salinity or access to sunlight or access to the movement of the water. Fresh water means that there's very low salinity. There's very little salt. This is the kind of water you can drink, but also our lakes. Some of you sampled from cedar water in your columns. Some of you sampled from basically stream runoff or road runoff and everything in the between. But one thing you all did is sample in freshwater environments. In New Jersey, these are going to be lakes and streams. We have freshwater wetlands. We have inland marshes. And where you go hiking and stuff, those are all probably fresh water. We do have an ocean here in New Jersey, obviously. Also, the Delaware River brings up salt water when the tides change. If you're up in North Jersey, the Raritan River itself, too, it also brings in salty water. Salt water creates a different environment for organisms to live. They have to tolerate higher levels of salt. Things like the ocean, the bays, estuaries. We have some amazing estuaries not that far from the campus where actually the eels are coming up now. We have coastal wetlands. In New Jersey, we have tidal, saltwater, and freshwater wetlands that run all the way up the Delaware River. So it's kind of a unique habitat that's not found in a lot of places. We don't really have much in the way of coral reefs or mangrove forests, but we certainly have a lot of diversity here. If I look at the world's distribution of salt and freshwater sources, the blues, the ocean here, we look at all kinds of mangroves. If you've ever been on tour in southern Florida, I highly recommend. We went to Key West one year on a whim. We're not Key West kind of people. And when we found out when we got down there, it wasn't quite what we wanted. So we actually ended up heading a little bit north, and we rented kayaks and a tour group, and we spent a whole day going through the mangroves. holy cow, absolutely amazing diversity just sitting there off of the trailer park that we'd parked at. Highly recommend that. And I'll talk a little bit more about mangroves. Coral reefs as well, although they're very fragile, and we do try to damage them as little as possible. What actually lives here? You probably imagine fish and starfish and corals, but the diversity is incredibly vast. We tend to look at the coastal regions and places where the waters and the creatures in the water are close to where we live. But there's an entire pelagic open ocean out there that gets really deep that we're still really very much learning about, in a whole series of very alien-like environments underneath our oceans. When we look at marine environments, and obviously I took this off of a textbook that I took out of another textbook and so on, so it's a little fuzzy, I'm sorry, but it's better than the one I could find from your text. We divide marine or ocean areas into two broad groups. We talk about them as being pelagic. Pelagic is the open ocean, where you're going to have to keep on swimming if you don't want to sink. This is where you sort of imagine whales living. I know you do. You imagine whales out in the open ocean, as opposed to the benthic part of the ocean, and we can use benthic in lakes and rivers too. This means on the bottom. So things that live on the bottom and spend time down here, they may crawl, or they may slide, or they may hold fast and not move around a lot. Pelagic animals swim. We also divide up the ocean based on how far light penetrates down. The top area of the ocean where the light penetrates and there's a lot of photosynthesis is called the photic zone. Photic means light. Below that, it's about 15 meters down, the light stops being able to penetrate in a full spectrum and then ultimately doesn't penetrate at all, and it becomes completely pitch black. That's the aphotic. A means not. It's no light zone. And that really that affects the types of animals and photosynthetic organisms that can live there. It's also going to affect the types of nutrients we find. Photosynthesis only occurs in the first 15 or so meters. The first 15 or so meters of a water body. Underneath there, everybody else is relying on nutrients that come from photosynthetic organisms to filter down, because they're unable to use the sun's energy at the bottom of the ocean. It's just too dark. When we look at the open sea and the ocean floor, we have vertical zones and horizontal zones. Vertical is this way, horizontal is lying along the horizon. We have zones where they are truly photic. That means there's truly lots of light coming through, and that's where I find things like plankton, phytoplankton, meaning it's photosynthetic. There's low nutrients here because when the nutrients are made by the organisms that live there, they fall down deeper and they leave that area pretty quickly. But there's a lot of sunlight, and that means there's a lot of photosynthesis, so we're converting a lot of energy into a useful form in that euphotic, truly photic zone. The winds, the waves churn up and bring oxygen into that area as well. So the surface of the water is generally very high in oxygen. The organisms that live there have a rich oxygen life. Notice we're not talking about temperature here. Temperature is not that big of a divider. The water can be very cold, as you know, from reaching in for your columns, and probably this week too as you go out and do your water sampling. But that does not mean that it's not teeming with life. It's the oxygen and the light that are determining light rather than the amount of cold or heat in that system. The bathal zone, the benthic zone, is in the middle of the ocean. It's dimly lit, meaning light gets through but not a lot. We're more likely to find zooplankton. These are plankton that eat phytoplankton, and plankton are just all of the little tiny things that are floating around, and microscopic or just a little bit visible, macroscopic. And fish, lots of little fishies. You're gonna, if you really watch, as I go through this lecture, and I keep showing you all the different environmental zones in aquatic system, almost all of them say, you got this kind of animal, and fish. And some slides, everyone has fish on it. Fish are a really big group. They are vertebrates. In this case, we're literally talking about fish, not starfish or other kinds of things we call fish. fish are pretty diverse and really well adapted to lots of different ecological systems. Kind of as an aside, a lot of the fish that you look at and you're like, that's a fish, so not a shark. These things have the ability to regulate and control their movement through the water column in a way that other animals don't. They can just kind of float there. Not jellyfish and things, but other things like mammals have to move often. Sharks have to move to maintain their position. Fish have really hedged in on that as a really good way to move into a lot of different habitats within the aquatic zones, particularly in the ocean. When I want to go really far down, I'm below the photic zone. I'm out in the pelagic zone. I actually can hit the very, very bottom. The ocean is very, very deep. As we go deeper, the pressure of the water pushes with more and more pressure. No light can come down into the abyssal zone. This is like the abyss, not abysmal zone, which is what I heard when I first learned it. It's not really sad. It's really deep. It's cold. It's dark. It's under a lot of pressure. We cannot go there. We have submarines that we send down close to it, but even then the pressure can crush our submarines. You can't go in the submarine. They're controlled by a radio wave. There are a lot of nutrients down here. All of the things that die on the surface float down to the bottom and nutrients accumulate, but there is no sunlight. We're not making new nutrients here. There's also very little oxygen. This is high nutrients, low dissolved oxygen. It's a really different world. There's very low light as well. This is a scene from Finding Nemo. It's a cartoon when they run into the lantern fish. This is a real one. This is very, very, very tiny, a couple centimeters big. This is a female. The male is actually attached to her right here. When we get down really deep into the abyssal zone, we find a lot of organisms using light as part of their biological functions. In Finding Nemo, the fish moved the little bit of light around and it fascinated Dory and Marlin, but who were the names of the fish. But here we do actually see that as a hunting strategy. This is a real organism and really, really weird, which is pretty typical of things in the abyssal zone because we're not familiar with them. As I move organisms and look at different kinds of zones in the ocean, I find very, very different kinds of organisms in each zone. They're distributed based on the temperature. So it's very, 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 my mouse here, very cold and dark down here. Or up here, the water can be quite warm and brightly lit. Dissolved oxygen content, lots of oxygen at the surface, very little at the bottom of the ocean. They use oxygen the same way we do. They use it to breathe, even if it's through gills or through transfer at the surface. They're really using that oxygen to make sure their mitochondria can do cell respiration. In the case of all of these animals, they work very similarly to us on a cellular level. They also need food. That food is used as an energy and a building blocks source. Up here, food is generally abundant as we reach the shore. Food is going to be abundant normally as we come into the photic zone, as long as we're not too far out into the ocean. Down here, there are high nutrients, but we're not really sure. I can't tell you for sure how much creatures are running into each other. We also have an abundance of creatures closer to the shore than when we move away. We think a lot of the open ocean is kind of just empty, and the animals are concentrated much closer to the coast where there's a higher abundance of food resources and basically higher stability as well. Sunlight, we've already talked about how far it goes really determines the amount and access of photosynthesis. Some a couple examples of things you might find in the pelagic zone. Little drifters of plankton, some sharks, they're nekton swimmers. That nekton means that they don't ever put their feet down. They live in the water column. Green turtles. We have on the benthos, we have sessile. That means they don't get up and walk. They are still. Organisms like sea fans or corals that live fixed to one place for their adult life. Now, when they're young, they're part of the plankton. They float around. Excuse me. These organisms live in the open ocean and they spend their time floating or swimming. Deep pelagic organisms, as we get deeper and deeper, these things become weirder and weirder looking because they're less and less familiar to us, because they live in an environment that we don't go into. This is my favorite. This is Actinopterigidae, means it's just a regular fish. This thing is ridiculous. It's very tiny. It's called a telescope fish. I feel like there's so many days, especially after spring break, that I just feel like that. Like, that's a vibe. I'm sure he's very, his mother loves him. They live in the deep, dark ocean. They are something we're less familiar with. Now don't write that down. Maybe it is. Maybe that's your vibe today too. The marine systems are incredibly important. They provide vital ecosystem services. I'm here in sort of an estuary mangrove on the edge here in my pictures, but I still want to talk about the fact that this is a saltwater marsh. This is salty water coming in here. A huge amount of the Earth's water is actually salinated. It's salty. It provides everything. The oceans and the saltwater systems provide things like climate moderation. They keep the storm from washing us away. They take up a lot of carbon dioxide. There's a lot of living things growing in here that are incorporating carbon dioxide into their bodies as they grow. They cycle our nutrients. They clean out the waste. They act as filters for soil, but also excess nutrients and poisons and toxins. As we've done things like restore the Hudson Bay, which is the bay by New York that the Raritan River runs into. One of the problems with the Hudson Bay is it was constantly like rivers of sewage was dumping into it from all directions. One of the mitigation strategies that they really have taken a hold of is building wider and wider buffer zones where we have things like salt marshes around that are taking those nutrients in, but also restoring the creatures that would have lived in the bay, things like clams and oysters. I've written to them in the hope that we can get, honestly did, because they have like elementary school programs, but they do have a college presentation. I'm going to see if they will let us have it, even though we're not in the Hudson Bay area, and talk about their restoration of shellfish and how that has led to cleaning waters. We require these systems to be in place because our food, our transportation routes, our protection against the storm. We recreate there, we hike there, and enjoy nature. But also these areas employ a massive number of people. They are subsidizing our fisheries basically by being nurseries for baby fishies. We use them for a huge part of our lives, and obviously we've overused and abused them, not understanding their importance. Overall, $12 million per year are coming from all of our marine ecosystems, just goods and services from wetlands. This is not fish. This is not all of the economy around the ocean. This is just buffering zones in this part of the country protecting us. Tides are absolutely play a role in how the ecosystem looks around the ocean. As I look at the ocean, I see an intertidal zone. That's an area between high and low tide. If you've ever been down to the shore and have looked at starfish, you're in the intertidal zone. Sometimes the zone comes up and the tides are too high. When it washes away, you can find all the tidal pools. Those things that live there have to live with the constant change of salinity, sometimes a lack of access to water. Their moisture is changing. They have to have a very unpredictable and possibly violent day-to-day life where the sea might be bashing up against them. We find a lot of things that hold on really tight or are really robust. The barrier islands that are off the coast of and protect our coast are these little islands that run parallel to the coastline, and they protect us from changing tides, but also from storms. And we find different kinds of creatures on these, sandy creatures, sandpipers. This is pretty New Jersey here, actually. We find tiger beetles and beach fleas, all of these things that are living in a basically a lump of sand that is protecting the coastline, and they naturally form. Rocky shores are pounded by waves, and barrier beaches are protecting us. Most organisms in these barriers are going to be able to dig or tunnel in the sand to protect themselves as the ocean moves, the tides move back and forth. Oh, we got this in here twice. Coastal aquatic system supports a ton of different marine species. It stabilizes the shoreline. I know I'm preaching to the choir here as I talk to you, because I've talked to you all a couple times over the semester through various assignments. I know you agree with me. I just want to stress that these areas are very vulnerable to change. They're very vulnerable to storms and human impacts. And they act as huge nurseries where lots of baby animals grow up. When we impact them, we destroy the nursery. So we destroy areas for growing up animals like salmon or eels that we may not expect to be living in a coastal inland area. Things like inlets and river mouths, bays, salt marshes. I want to highlight mangrove forest as we go through, and seagrass beds have an inordinate impact on the species diversity in the region they are in. They are really full of species. Coastal wetlands and estuaries are where the river meets the sea. These are areas that also act as buffers against pollution coming from the land and prevent it from getting into the ocean. So I want to sidestep a little bit and talk about mangrove forests, because we don't have any here. And I think all the other regions I could send you out to look at, and I think you might be somewhat familiar. Mangroves are someplace that are found around warmer areas of the world, in Africa, in southern United States, in South America, and around Asia. They're a kind of plant that grows right at the edge of the water and kind of into the water. They establish at those edges and they hold on because they have these really unique roots. The roots can kind of grow down and then back up again. And they create, some of them, they're really cool. They grow up tubes and they actually breathe through tubes coming out of the ground because their roots are saturated. But these provide a structure for creating a unique habitat and holding on to the soil right at the edge of the coastlines. These are salt water areas. Again, I highly recommend, if you ever get a chance to move through them in a kayak or a canoe. It's definitely a unique ecosystem that we don't see here in New Jersey. You know the drill here. Now we move into what humans do. Humans always disrupt and degrade ecosystems. We're going to talk about how they disrupt and degrade marine ecosystems. I think you're going to start to get the pattern here. It's always the same kind of problems. Too many people overfish. We poison the area. We overuse the area. Climate change is impacting these regions faster than they can adapt. We degrade and fracture things. It's pretty much the playbook for humans. And then we bring in a bunch of invasive species that impact the land. What do you think? What do you think is the worst one? And you're like, holy cow, what? They're terrible. Yeah, I think I agree probably with you. What's the biggest threat to marine ecosystems? And then let's consider what's the biggest threat to things like coral reefs and mangroves. And is there anything that we can do about this? So kind of no great answer. But maybe some of them I do have ways to help. I want to show you the Chesapeake Bay watershed as an example of a place where we have been doing actually some successful mitigation. I was going to do Hudson Bay, but I think you're probably more familiar with Chesapeake Bay watershed. We are not in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but we're close enough that when you drive somewhere, you probably see the signs that you're entering it. We in Camden County are part of the Delaware River watershed, which actually the Delaware River flows to the ocean. It's from Philly to us. Along the Appalachian Ridge. On the other side of the Appalachian Ridge, we head into the Chesapeake Bay watershed. If you head up to North Jersey, or if you're coming from there, you're probably part of the Raritan River watershed or the Stony Brook Millstone watershed, which runs into the Raritan. If you're not sure, I do have watershed maps as we go through this to see where your rainwater is actually flowing and what watershed you are part of. your lab the other day where you looked at the flow of erosion and you did the melting ice. That's a little bit about looking at how how a watershed actually works. The Chesapeake Bay watershed is one of the biggest watersheds, if not the biggest watershed in the United States. There's about 18.5 million people that live in the region that actually washes into the Chesapeake Bay. It's 64,000 square miles. It's huge. Up from, this is Cooperstown, New York up here, all the way, this is Southern Virginia. The massive increase in the population, this is where people live. This is that urban metropolis area on the East Coast that kind of just spreads everywhere. That massive development has led to an increase in point and non-point source pollution. So pollution coming from specific factories or farms, and pollution coming from just people living their everyday lives. We definitely, as an impact of having increasing number of people, have overfished, and importantly in our watersheds, over shellfished, where those shellfish that would have been cleaning the water are now lacking, and now we're missing their contribution to filtering particulates and poisons out of the water. And in Chesapeake Bay and in the Raritan River watershed, huge programs to grow back the shellfish, because those things do 10 times the work of filtering that just barriers that we could build could do. And frankly, this entire watershed is being built into an urban area. This is where people live in the United States in a huge way. There's an enormous number of people here that are just impacting the land by existing. If I show you a slightly different picture, this is from a high school version of your textbook, but I feel like you don't have this quite a zoom in picture in yours. And we look at the oxygen levels. This is the green, here is the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We can see that there's areas here with the oxygen level, and this is from too many nutrients causing the living things to kind of overproduce and then die. And when you die, you suck the oxygen out of the water, or suck the oxygen out of the environment from rotting. We can see the impact of really human-driven change that is causing these parts, which is this is a huge area, to have different oxygen levels and lower oxygen levels than the living organisms in that water actually need. This is directly due to human impact. Bit of warning. I got some pretty upsetting photos in the next couple bit. I don't know if you're watching me on super like double time or something, but just FYI, I think they're important. Not gratuitous, but I think we want to talk about the fact that we overharvest, and that's a huge impact on marine ecosystems. We've already talked about overfishing. One of you talked about specifically overharvesting of salmon. I left that off because you had talked about it so eloquently in your discussion, and I think that will continue as we go through. Overharvesting is something people do, particularly with food, but we have been particularly egregious in doing it in the oceans, and I think that the impression is that the oceans and the bounty of the oceans is infinite, so we can't have an impact. We've hunted whales for as much time as we've been able to hunt whales, as humans have been able to go out. But in the last 100 and 150 years, the impact of our ability to hunt whales has gotten so good, and the whales we're not hunting them in a sustainable way. We used to keep our lights lit by whale oil. It was a major industry in the 1800s and before. Modern times, it's really about eating them, or research. Which a lot of this falls under, and that's like, if you're not getting the sarcasm there, nobody researches whales that much. Cetaceans is the group that dolphins are in. In some countries, they are not protected, and are a permanent food source. I want you to draw a line here as you think about it. There are some places in the world where people culturally eat whales, and then there are places where people like to eat whales because they're, delicious, or they are something wealthy people eat, or they're just interesting to eat. And I feel like, on a super personal point of view, those are two very different things. If you look up, and this is up to you, If you look up the Inuit hunting of whales, it is culturally significant. I think the Faroe Islands, their hunting of whales is a culturally significant event that is confined to once a year. That feels a little different to me than mass hunting, so that I'm making soup out of them or medicine out of just parts of them. But to think on, if you're considering that for your second paper, that we hunt them in a way that's very unsustainable and possibly unnecessary in many modern societies. Commercial fishing kind of follows the same thing. The ocean's infinite, so we can fish forever. We know we're having a huge impact on a lot of fish. I've seen it in my own lifetime. The type of fish that are available has changed. That's partially a response to the fact that fish that were very popular in the 1980s were overfished so heavily that they're not available anymore. Commercial fishing is a billion-dollar industry. It grows every year. As the population in the world grows, fish, especially because fish is considered a healthy alternative to other things, fish becomes a resource that takes people make a lot of money getting. Overfishing is the idea of not doing it in a sustainable way. If fish can't reproduce fast enough for us to fish them, we probably shouldn't be. We also fish in ways that destroy the entire habitat and other things that we're not fishing. So it's called the bycatch, the catch of things that we didn't really want. And a lot of fishing practices are just kill them all and sort them out later, and then something like a turtle is caught up in them. Nobody's eating that. That was just killed as a byproduct of the process of fishing. We looked at drift nets, longline fishing, and trawling are all economically pretty good and ecologically horrific ways of catching fish. In drift nets, you just drag this is drift netting, and you drag a net behind you, you suck them all up and kill them, and then you sort them. Long line fishing has long lines with bait on them. Anything that goes after the bait will be killed in this process. And trawling is literally just dragging something across the bottom of the ocean. You bring up everything and destroy it all. The other side of this for you to consider as we go forward is the biggest contributor to plastics in the ocean is fishing nets that are then, when they tear, we cut them loose and we let them go into the ocean, and it's plastic. This is habitat destruction at its finest. We're killing the animals and overfishing in an unsustainable way, but then also digging up the bottom. We're good at habitat destruction in the ocean in other ways. You've seen pictures of, and I literally had hundreds of pictures to pick from. I tried to pick the ones that were actually least upsetting. I couldn't decide. I think you can search for things if you want. If you have an oil spill, so this is the way that we power our homes, a lot of that oil comes from ocean platforms, or we have to ship it through the ocean. There's always the possibility that it will spill. The oil on birds' feathers or around animals interferes with their life processes. It disrupts food webs, but it also disrupts their ability to live. It also decreases the ability for things to photosynthesize because it cuts off light access to the under part of the water. The oil sits on top, but it smothers the world. I do want to point out that in New Jersey, in Camden County, and in Burlington County and Salem, we have a lot of oil processing plants. My husband works at a refinery where they process oil that comes in from somewhere else. It's brought in on big tankers, and then they refine it. They turn it into the kind of petroleum products that we need from that plant. One of his, and this is what he does, is actually make sure that we don't have a spill or we don't have an explosion. One of the ways that they really truly manage that is as they come in, you can see these on the Delaware River. There are buoys everywhere. These little booms so I called it a buoy. This is a buoy. This is a boom. They're actually absorbent material that floats on the surface, and it picks up any oil that might be leaking, even if we don't know if there's a spill. This is a form of physical control. One of the things they do at his plant is if there's even a hint that something is going to be releasing petroleum products, they actually have a tank that they spray bacteria on it, and the bacteria eat it up. Then they have a bunch of booms surrounding it, and they're trying to protect the estuaries in the Delaware River. So I think we can very easily start to feel like everything is just crazy pollutants and no one's doing anything, but there are mitigation of the problems. We are aware that oil spills are a problem. It's just, is it cost effective becomes the issue. And how much money can you make before you actually have to treat the problem? So maybe this, my husband's job depends on the fact that they might do something like this, but also it costs a lot of money, so they limit the number of people that are monitoring this, and there's a balance, in industry between safety regulations and, I'm maybe a little jaded here, I can hear it in my voice, safety regulations and environmental regulations. But I do want to say that, like, when people get really upset or we find out it's really terrible, sometimes we can do something about it. Do you remember microbeads? I feel like you may be on the edge of where you might not remember it, but you used to buy all these products that had these scrubbing beads in it, and they would burst or they would just scrub you really good. They were exfoliating beads in your toothpaste or in your face wash. They were little pieces of plastic. And they made it, they was a scrubby your face. It felt really nice. But then they had this huge ecological footprint where they were really damaging the ecology. They've been removed from the shelf. We don't produce microbead products anymore. And that did, absolutely. Why are we introducing these tiny pieces of plastic into the environment? We've got other plastic problems. But these we've been able to do. There was backlash against them, and we've been able to remove them from a pollutant stream. Our ocean is hard to protect in general, however, because people think it's infinite. Holy cow, if you've ever been out on the ocean where you can't see the shore, it feels like eternity out there. And despite that, our ecological footprint, which we're going to do in a couple weeks, we'll calculate it, but like our individual impact on the world and our fish print, how many fish we eat, is actually expanding, especially as people find that fish is good for you. And it's good for your brain. It's got the right kind of oils in it. And, you got to balance that health impact with the fact that 8.4 billion people all want to fish. Much of the ocean's damage isn't visible. It's out there somewhere. And you can't see it from the shore. It's just also not part of somebody's jurisdiction that wants to do anything about it. A lot of the ocean, and this is a blob of words, I realize, marine sanctuaries protect ocean systems, but 200 miles off of the coast of any ocean, any land is free range. It's open to everyone. We have the high seas, like the pirates sailed the high seas, and they did that because they weren't subjected to any particular rule of any particular country. The fish industry fishes in the high seas because the laws don't apply to them in a way that they do closer to the shore. We do have a treaty where coastal nations have jurisdiction over about 36% of the ocean surface. It's 90% of the fish. They tend to live closer to the shores. But some countries use this to fish more. Marine protected areas protect from human activities, but only in areas where they're enforced and jurisdictions that are enforcing them. And this is not going to be your usual cast of characters here. Marine fishing is really surprisingly difficult to regulate because there is a cultural component, but also why are you telling me what to do in the vast ocean component to it? The establishment of marine reserves has led to some mitigation, some control of that. And we close them to commercial fishing, maybe at different times of the year or all the time. We may not let any human activity occur in those areas. They're protected, but this has to be enforced. And sometimes we enforce this by creating recreational areas where it's only used for recreation. When we do this, we find the fish populations quickly rebound. They double back up. The size of the fish increases, and reproduction of those fish increases. We give them an abundance of resources and a lot of space and remove those limiting factors of human impact. But now they become really appealing for fishermen, fisher people, fishers. Fishers to me is an animal, but I think fishers is the right word here. when we manage these, I want you to consider all of these things. I am not going to ask you to write up and solve this problem. I don't have a solution for this, but I'd like you to think about marine fishing particularly as being one of the challenges of the next generation. This is your challenge, I think, in protecting the world, along with global climate change and all the other things that are going wrong. Just this, you get to your 20s. But I do tell you, none of this is new. So, and I will, as we go forward, I know this is getting long, as we go forward into part 2 and into other parts of the class, I will consistently remind you that we have had successes in the past, that we are doing better at this. We have learned to control a lot of the problems, the overfishing, the overharvesting. All of these are just things that we need to control, but we have a history of being successful in those. So I don't want you to walk away from this and be like, we're screwed. I don't think we are, but I think we are at a point where we need to be aware of this in our everyday life, but it is not on you to fix all this. This is a combined process of everyone on the planet that's going to have to work together, and we actually have a history of that working, and I'll show you in the next couple lectures. I will see you in part 2. This one's a little bit longer than part 2, so I'll end it there, and I'll see you in a little bit. All right. Bye-bye.